as I say, welcome to the Audit Committee, the first of the council year in extraordinary circumstances. It is going to be tricky to run this sort of hybrid type meeting. I think it's one we've all got to get used to. So let's kick off. Item 1 is sort of welcome to everybody. Hope everyone is keeping safe. Secondly, apologies for absence.
I've got apologies from Councillor Oles and Councillor Gregory, Councillor McMahon and Councillor Chapman are going remotely.
Great, thanks very much. And item 3, declarations of interest.
Thank you, Chair. My declaration of interest is in agenda item 9, performance review report, page 72, in regard to the housing supply programme. I have a family member that has currently a contracted work with the Hackney Council.
Great, thanks very much. Well, that's noted. And then item 4.
Just in case,
sorry, missed you.
I haven't noticed it, but just in case there's any mention of the pension fund or whatever, I am happy to mention it.
Great, thanks, Ian. Any other points? Okay, move on to item 4, appointment of chair and vice chair. I think it's for noting, isn't it?
It's for noting.
Yeah, I mean, in the past we've had to appoint at the committee, but now we've got a new process where it's decided at the council. So I'm assuming the chair, I think, with some authority. Great. Let's then touch on the minutes, item 5, minutes of the previous meeting. And I'm assuming there are no corrections, but if there are any, please let me know. And if not, can we just pick up any of the matters arising? Peter, do you want to just take us?
Yeah, the matters arising have been actioned. I said 5.2, 5.4 and 5.10, they've been actioned.
Yeah, so Gilbert, you got the point about the council's obligations in relation to temporary accommodation, which I think, yeah, good. And Chair, risks around climate change and workforce be included, and that has been done. Okay, if there's no other points, can we then move on to Audit Committee terms of reference, which again I think are mainly for noting. I don't think, unless anyone's got any points. I mean, I think that it is worth just saying that these are modernised terms of reference which reflect both the role of the Audit Committee in the wider council, that is, that it's a committee now of the council, not a subcommittee as it was of the Corporate Committee. And secondly, that it is an opportunity, or needs to be reviewed on a regular basis, and we will be reporting to this month's annual this month's meeting with our annual report, and that will become a regular part of our process. The only other thing I think to point out is that we will also be responsible, and are also responsible, for the overall governance and effectiveness of the committee. And item 40 of it, to put in place effective working relationships with the Standards Committee and Scrutiny function to ensure appropriate collaborative working, is a new principle which I think is important. It's been happening, but I think we note that it's now officially part of how we operate. And I've been talking to the chairs of the Scrutiny Committee to make sure that our programme of scrutiny fits in with the overall Scrutiny Commission's. So I'm not seeing any indications or questions on terms of reference. Yep. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Just to go on about our low carbon strategy and climate emergency, there's no mention of climate at all there, no mention of low carbon strategy in terms of integration in all the overall strategies of the council. And I think it would be quite interesting and good to have that in there, something like that in there. So, you know, integration with and implementation of other campus strategies and that an overarching low carbon decarbonisation approach.
I mean, I think this is a very important issue, and it goes to the heart of what audit should be about, which is we've got a plan around energy use, which we were hearing about a little earlier today. That has massive financial implications in terms of commitments over several councils, actually. And I think you're absolutely right to point to the need for us to be reassured there is a robust financial framework which reconciles all the other pressures on the council. And certainly that's something I think now we have an energy strategy which has some timetables and the beginning of a programme. I think you're absolutely right. We should be quizzing that and really understanding that. And I'd see that as something we absolutely need to do alongside the scrutiny commissions to ensure that financial side of this programme is robust. And we'll certainly follow that up and report back.
Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Sorry, do you have an additional point, Ian? Are you?
No.
The same.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. Okay, let's move on then to finance update. Do you want to ensure Rob can play an earlier part?
That's okay, Chair.
Yeah. No, I'm very happy with that. Can I just introduce Rob? I did ask Rob to join us to update us on on what we can say about the cyber attack and its impact, because you'll have seen in the performance review there are several places where either we don't have numbers on how the council is performing, which is worrying, and other areas where the service is simply not able to perform at the levels we would like to do. And therefore, this becomes a key aspect of our oversight as to the council's performance. And I felt it was important members had an update. Rob is not unnaturally under enormous pressure at the moment, and I wanted to give us a chance to have a brief update, some questions, with a promise down the track that we would have a fuller discussion with members, fuller update in 2 or 3 weeks. I think that's somewhere. So, Rob, do you want to just say what you can about where we are at the moment?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
I can, yeah.
And can colleagues joining online hear me okay? Rather than filling in the microphone.
I'm not seeing any complaints on the, but I'll let you know if I see anything. Yeah.
Right. So thank you, Councillor Sharman. So yes, to set the scene, I'm hoping that in 3 to 4 weeks' time we'll be in a position to bring a more holistic update in terms of where the services are at the moment in their recovery. We've moved on a long way since October. There are some services which remain significantly impacted. There are some services where our recovery is further advanced, and there are some services where the recovery of the systems is well advanced, but the services still need to catch up with a significant amount of work that they've not been able to do while the systems have been unavailable. So my intention is to bring an update which gives committee and other briefings with wider members as well in terms of where we are. We've in terms of our recovery work, we've been able to recover some of our key systems. So, for example, the recent elections were successfully run using the electoral system we were able to restore. Colleagues will be aware that there were some aspects of that where, for example, for postal voters, we asked people registered to vote by post to re-register their signatures because we weren't able to recover that data or weren't able to recover it within the time needed to be able to run the election successfully. Thankfully, that decision was made early. Communication went out to people registered to vote by post promptly in January, and a very large number of people completed that update in terms of their signatures. In terms of other services, I think areas which will be of, I'm presuming to assume that the areas which are most interested members will be areas such as housing benefits, such as revenues, council tax, business rates. In those, we have recovered the main system that those services use to manage those payments. I would summarise it as 3 key stages. One is bringing the system back. The next is reconciling a large amount of transactions which we have taken place while that system has been offline. So we have managed to continue to pay 38,000, in the region of 38,000 people's worth of housing benefits throughout the attack. What we haven't been able to do is make adjustments where there have been changes in circumstances and process new claims. So there are some people for whom the impact of this is very significant. The action we took to be able to sustain those payments has meant that that was contained to a smaller number of people. Although each of those people, it's very important to us that we're supporting them as best we can and recovering their payments as quickly as we can. So whilst we have managed to make the majority of payments, I don't want to underplay the impact on those people who have been affected. The system has been recovered. We're now doing some very complicated work to bring those payments we've made back into the system and reconcile them against the data in the system. The benefits team, if we start with that, have now started to work through the backlog of cases that accumulated in the period of time they didn't have their system. I have to, throughout the whole council, praise my colleagues across services for their determination to sustain services where they can and do everything possible to recover and sustain services, particularly to vulnerable residents throughout. So we have started that process. We expect in benefits, it will be in the region of 3 to 6 months before we have completed that backlog of work, because they are catching up with about 7 months worth of work. They have worked very carefully to prioritise those cases, so people where there's greatest risk to tenancies, greatest anxieties are being dealt with first. And I know that there's a significant number of cases where those have now been processed, payments made, and I've seen the communication from residents in some of those cases explaining why that mattered to them so much. There is still hard work to go through, but we are on a recovery path rather than we're stuck in technical complexity path. But there is still a lot of work to do. Similarly, in revenues, it's a similar story where, again, we have new people who've come into the borough. We have cases where there's changes, new applications for deductions and the like, which the teams will now start to work through. There's additional complexity to that, but I kind of don't want to get too lost in technical details. But that broad narrative of the systems are significantly progressive recovery, more technical work to do, but the services aren't waiting until everything's fixed before they can start to process those cases. But the complexity is significant. Probably the other area which I suspect will be highest in terms of members' casework will be areas like land charges. For land charges, we were able to recover significant amounts of the data that is required to carry out land searches, and we launched what we called a partial land searches service in January. Again, that service then has to catch up with a huge amount of casework and applications that are built up while the systems are unavailable. There are also some aspects of the data that the land charges service use which we've not yet been able to recover. So that is why we've described it as a partial search service. So the council, senior officers, including Ian, have worked with central government and mortgage lenders, seeking to get to the position where more mortgage lenders will accept indemnities against areas where we can't provide land searches data at this point in time. So seeking not just to restore the service, but also take any steps we can to work with the mortgage industry to help people progress their transactions. Again, an area where I know that the human story there is really significant. And this all comes back to rapidly growing threat around the types of attack we've suffered. I think the figure I saw reported in the news 2 weeks ago was that in 3 months last year, there have been something over 4 times as many cases reported as there have been in the previous year prior to that. So we're seeing serious organised crime turning its attentions in a very pernicious and organised way against all manner of businesses. Again, education is another area that's been affected. I saw a school in Kent today. We saw the Irish health system affected recently, and East Coast fuel supplies in America. Coming back to our recovery work, there are some areas where it remains uncertain how we recover the data because of the complexity and technology side of that work. But in broad terms, I think we've moved a long way since when I briefed Audit Committee previously, which I think was in January, early in January. There is still a lot of work to do. That bring us to the finances. So the finances that we reported, I think, was again covered in the Hackney Citizen with their interview with the Mayor. We're still operating with a broad window of the potential financial impacts, but not at this point in time able to say it's exactly this much because of the complexity of the work. Where we can, we're seeking to spend money that we would otherwise have been investing in systems to recover. So if I pick a couple of examples, we'd already been working with the planning service to move to a modern cloud-based planning system. So we are recovering data into that system rather than bringing back the old system. Likewise, with our colleagues in legal services, we've been in a similar point. So again, legal casework is being recovered into the new modern cloud-based system. We're not recovering the old legacy system. And there's I think I said in January, there's a shift here from technology that has its origins in the late 90s, early 2000s, when the internet was a very different beast. And we're working where we can to follow the strategy we had already set of moving to modern cloud-based services, which are designed around the modern internet. However, again, a point I made in January, the progress of technology is relentless, so it won't be a point where we've solved technology. So we need to continue, as we have been prior to and since the attack, investing in our modernisation of our technology.
Great. I'm just very conscious of the time. We might. You've given us a very full kind of background. I think and we certainly need to. I think have a sort of more informal session. I don't know. Rob Chapman is on the line. Whether Rob is the sort of overview person responsible. Whether you wanted to add anything to Rob's report on cyber.
Well, thanks, Nick. No, I've nothing really to add to the report. I think that's a very good overview. We're hoping, as we discussed, to have a session for the wider membership as soon as we can organise, because I know we're all having increasing concerns expressed to us in our email, I was going to say post bags, but our email bag inboxes. I think right. I think I'd just stress the point that it struck me some weeks ago now that the resolution of this is not going to be a sort of on-off situation. And we're not going to be in a situation where one day it's a problem, the next day it's all solved. Some of the issues here, I think, are going to take a very long time to get back together. And I think it's important that members and the public begin to have an understanding of that.
A bit like COVID, we're going to have to learn to live with it for a number of years, I think, is what we're saying. Yeah. Great, thanks, Rob. Any questions? Yes, Gilbert.
Thank you. So, how much financial assistance the government have given you in regards to helping with this problem? During and looking forward, very money from the government, what help are you getting from the government?
Yeah. Could we take questions rather than trying to? Let's group the questions, and then Rob, and I guess it's partly Ian as well, because you're closer to the government finance. Ian.
Yeah, I just very lining the obvious question is that very briefly, what are we doing to prevent any further attacks, and what is the likely cost of that, and how far are we along the line preparing for that? Just a note, and I can't remember which council it was I was reading yesterday, it had numerous cyber attacks against it, and I wondered if we had any further cyber attacks or any kind of attacks like that.
No, good questions. Ian, do you want to sort of pick up what
I deal quickly with the money point? So far, we have drawn down about £50,000 of support in terms of grant to help us procure the system support from BAE. At this point, we haven't asked the government for any direct further support, but we are making sure we communicate extensively with them about the challenges that we're facing. What's difficult about concluding that is, of course, we don't yet know the final scale of the financial challenge, but Rob and I are in extensive dialogue with officials at MHCLG and working very closely with them to see what support we can draw down. Of course, we don't want support that comes with so many strings attached, it ties our hands. So we're being very careful in that space, but I will keep the committee updated as that progresses.
But I think the point Ian makes about having a robust forward strategy is absolutely key. We do not want to be in this position again, and it's clearly a problem that's ramping up at an incredible rate across the world at the moment. So we need to be at the sort of beginning of some process which we can defend ourselves. Okay, I propose to move on, but I think it's very, very helpful, Rob. And then if you can plan some sort of briefing, and hopefully in a slightly more intimate form, so we can get the conversation going rather than this. But very helpful start. Thanks for that. Yeah, Ian.
I just wanted to make a comment. I mean, Rob Miller knows only too well what I'm like. I still keep my typewriter spoiled and ready to go.
And the back.
Great stuff. Okay. Well, Rob, you can get back to coping with the crisis now. Ian, you want to? The next item is the finance report. Are you going to? Huh? Oh, apologies, Anna. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Are we supposed to say what our name is? So I don't know if people can see us. Can they see us?
Sorry, I can't hear you, Toby.
Are we supposed to say what our name is before we speak?
It's a good idea. Yes, I must say I'm feeling my way with this whole.
I just wanted to say on 2 points that Rob mentioned. I have gone through the journey of purchasing a property and going through the whole land searches, and actually it can be done. It isn't as horrific as but it is still challenging. But I know that most mortgage providers will do indemnity. But again, it's a cost that happens when you. My second thing was just some feedback, which I have fed back to Rob as well, is that I have been a customer to ring up the service centre, and I have to say every time I've rung up in the last few months, I think the staff have been fantastic, because it is absolutely bonkers that you literally can't pay anything for them. I'm basically shoveling money to the side to ensure that, because no one can take the money off you if you wanted to. So I think my question, which I think is actually detailed in the report, is that I think for us as members, that there is assurance for those people that aren't able to sort of shuffle money across, that actually are on limited incomes anyway, any additional money is probably likely to get hoovered up. They might not be in a position to keep money aside, so to speak, put it on the mantelpiece as people have done in previous times. What happens? Will there be a situation where people aren't going to be presented with potentially a huge sort of council tax bill? Will there be an opportunity for people to pay in a way that won't essentially affect their credit either? I mean, because that's a big thing for people as well. So if people are, with your council tax, sometimes you might pay a couple of months and then it tapers out. We're not suddenly going to say to somebody next March, oh, you owe, I don't know, £1,500 or whatever council tax or rent fees, plus you've got to pay the next year. I think that for us as members, we need that assurance that people aren't going to be suddenly asked to demand huge amounts of.
Yeah, great. Ian, do you want to pick that up?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that question, Councillor Lynch, because I think it's one which we're very live to as officers, and it's one which we've discussed extensively. So, for example, you'll be aware of the Council's one approach to corporate debt and the already great progress we've made in that space. But we're looking to make sure we put in place the safeguards to avoid situations you've outlined happening, in particular council tax, but there'll be a stream of other income sources that will be affected like that. So you have our assurance that we're very much on top of that, working closely with Councillor Chapman and other cabinet members in that space.
Good.
Just very, very quickly, reminders that people pay their council tax. I've got a friend who basically sort of gets this reminder and then pays his council tax. We haven't received a reminder, and he's wondering if he will get a reminder soon, if that's possible or not.
So we're still in the progress of restoring the normal services around council tax. So what we are working towards being in a position where people's kind of interaction with the council tax service will be as they normally expect. But there are a number of different systems involved in that process. So the main income system, it's a joint system across revenues and benefits. That system's been recovered, but there are other systems which those services use, which we're still working through. I'm not sure, I'm afraid.
Okay, thanks again, Rob, and convey our thanks to you and your colleagues for being at the front line on this. Great. Okay, move on to the next item.
I wasn't sure, Councillor Jarman, if you wanted to cover the performance overview report.
Yeah, I was going on to the finance update. Yeah.
So if it's okay with people, we'll present some slides. So hopefully this will. Great stuff. So, good evening, everybody, and great to be back in the council chamber for Audit Committee. Wow. So, this evening, you won't be surprised to hear we're going to run through a range of topics which I'm sure you're all expecting. So, firstly, we'll cover off where we are with the financial position and the outturn forecast for the last financial year, so 2021. We'll also cover where we are with the current year's budget and the great progress we've made in making sure we're implementing all of the savings initiatives which were signed off as part of the budget for 21-22. We'll also update members on where we got to with regards to the medium-term financial forecast, and then we'll set out the progress we're making in relation to the financial year 2022-23 budget and the next steps. And we'll also, as we're at Audit Committee in particular, make sure you're all updated on where we are with regards to the financial year 2019-20 and the 2020-21 final accounts. So there's quite a lot in this presentation, Chair, that we're going to run through this evening. So if it's okay with members, I'll go through it and then take questions at the end.
Yeah, please.
If there's anything really unclear, just please do either in real time put your hands up, or virtually if people could indicate to Councillor Jarman, I'm happy to take questions. So very quickly then, general fund forecast, and we're busy closing the accounts for this financial year, is showing for 2020-21 an overspend of around £2.2 million. We're obviously just now in the process of doing some final reconciliations and final checking, but we're putting together the figures for each of the departments and then doing the work that's necessary in relation to the capital programme and the balance sheet, and in particular making sure that we get the asset valuations right. As part of the work we did and outlined at our last Audit Committee meeting, we are currently looking to bring a provisional outturn to the Cabinet meeting in June, and that will sort of outline for people where we've got to in terms of the forecasts, and I'd be optimistic, and from what I've seen so far, that we won't be too far away from the projections we've been making throughout the year, and you'll all be familiar with how that's moved. We are working very hard at this point to make sure that we maximise the utilisation of all the COVID monies, and also finalising the returns, in particular in relation to sales fees and charges, the next one of which we've just finalised, and I'd be expecting government to come back to us very soon in relation to agreeing the numbers that we've included. So big thanks to the team for all the work that's gone into not just completing those returns, but also to making sure that all the financial monitoring information that we've submitted now on a monthly basis to central government has been done. It's certainly been, in addition to everything else, a significant task for them all. Turning to the housing revenue account, not a great deal shifted, I think, since the last presentation we gave in terms of overall forecasts, but as you can see, the impact of the pandemic overlaid by cyber is significant, and we're looking at a projected overspend in terms of changes in income and additional spend of around £5.2 million in terms of loss of rental income, and around £1.4 million in terms of impacts upon the DLO due to them not being able to undertake the works that they would have normally have done in people's homes due to the restrictions, and in which case they've still incurred the spend around wages, salaries of the team, but haven't been able to do the works which they would normally have done. The impact of the pandemic is also subject to continually change, because we're having to do a lot of detailed rent reconciliation work due to the impact of the cyber attack. But as I said before, I'm really grateful to all the work that the team have done. How are we meeting this impact? Well, we're meeting it because ultimately we have to balance the housing revenue account, a reduction in the revenue contribution to capital, and partly this has been enabled because of a short-term slowdown in the delivery of the capital programme due to the restrictions that have been in place, and we've also looked to allocate some additional costs to the capital programme. Budget risks that continue going forwards relate to rent collection, the impact of COVID on tenants' ability to pay, the impact of the cyber attack on our systems, and obviously there's a backlog in the court system where we need to progress necessary possession cases. We've also got a long-standing issue in relation to Thames Water Agency, and we're trying to get collective agreement on this across London, but we have had to set aside funds in the 2019-20 accounts in relation to potentially any challenges we have in relation to that. So update quickly on where we are as London. As you can see, the position across London, estimated financial impact across the capital for the boroughs of around £2.2 billion. And this was up from the estimate that was initially put in by boroughs back in April 2020. Not surprisingly, it increased because at that point in time, of course, we weren't expecting COVID to have such a long-term impact. So broadly speaking, the breakdown is around 50-50 in terms of spend and income loss. It'll be no surprise to people that the main area of additional spend is in relation to adult social care, but also across London, a big factor was the unachieved savings that were delivered or couldn't be delivered by boroughs. Also, no surprise that significant impact due to lost fees and charges income estimated. During this time, we've seen a number of councils encounter serious financial difficulties, Croydon being one, which issued 2 Section 114 notices and all that goes with that, as well as 2 other boroughs requiring, Bexley requiring a capitalisation directive, and some other boroughs outside London also requiring the same. SEND pressures, of which I know a number of people in this room have been real campaigners on, in terms of raising the issue and also making sure that we're lobbying hard on it, continues to be a real challenge for London, with cumulative London losses approaching £100 million per annum now. Turning to the budget for the current financial year, we're currently in the process of completing the first budget monitor for the year, and this will be going to the July Cabinet meeting. The main risk factors, as you'd expect, are progress on the delivery of savings, any impacts of COVID, which wouldn't have been factored into budgets, not just in the general fund, but also in the HRA, and any what I call COVID scarring, in terms of demand pressures coming through the system that were masked or hidden by the lockdown and by all the restrictions in place. And we are really working closely with all of the respective directorates to make sure that we're really on top of all of that. And of course, we can't forget, as Rob's outlined, the impact of the cyber attack. So an awful lot going on in the delivery of the budget for 2021-22, and I would really encourage all members to take a real interest in the overall financial position report, which we take to Cabinet on a monthly basis, because we will be setting out in detail how the position continues to evolve and change. What I'm confident of is the team we've got in place in terms of the finance team working closely with directorates will make sure that the position we report is accurate and is robust, as it's been now for many years. Early indications from some checks we've been putting in place, as you'd expect now that we're into the 3rd month of this current financial year, are that of all the directorate savings that were agreed as part of the 2021-22 budget, they're all on track to be delivered. So that's a really encouraging sign. And we've had a good run through of that at the corporate management team and with Cabinet members as well. So I don't know, Councillor Chapman, if you'd want to add any more at this point, or you're happy for me to continue on.
Thank you, Ian. No, the only part I'd say in relation to 21-2 is obviously it's, and we made this point repeatedly to Cabinet members and chief officers, that it's important to keep bearing down on costs. And we await with the first monitoring report with it, keenly, because the implementation of the savings we've agreed, and particularly the vacancy factor, will be important, not just for 21-2, but obviously has big implications for future years as well.
Thank you. Turning to the medium-term financial plan, and particularly focusing now on the budget for next financial year. So quite a few financial years we're going to cover this evening. You'll know from the report that we took to full council back in late February that we're forecasting a budget gap at that point of around £11.2 million in 22-23, increasing to £24 million in 23-24. Obviously, that's a cumulative amount, not an additional £24 million on top of the £11.2 million to be found. That forecast reflects the ongoing uncertainties and expectations that we will have a fairer funding review at some stage in the near future, and obviously we have to take that into account in our forecasts. We've also recognised the challenges around recovering some of those income levels that we had in place post-COVID, and also estimates of service pressures, but also particularly things like recognising ongoing pay award issues, and the fact that there will be a legacy of COVID that will run for many years and probably hasn't yet emerged yet. So significant uncertainty in some of our external funding in this plan, and it's why the Mayor, working closely with Councillor Chapman and Cabinet members, is lobbying very intensively on government for that degree of certainty. And I would really hope that as part of a comprehensive spending review, we don't just get a 1-year settlement again, we actually get 3-year settlement, ideally with local government properly resourced, properly funded, and resources not redistributed to different parts of the country, but actually local authorities properly funded in terms of the services that they provide. So Councillor Chapman's working very closely with Cabinet colleagues supporting this development of savings, and we've issued a timetable outlining our basic direction of travel to make sure, as always, the council maintains its strong record of having strong financial management and delivering a balanced budget to plan and to timetable. I'll maybe pause there before going on to the accounts, Councillor Sharma, if that's okay. I'm happy to take any questions from people.
So, any question? I mean, I do think two things arise from this report. First of all, that our estimate of the budget gap of around 2 million, which we've held, looks as if it was a robust one. And that is important because it means that we can be fairly clear that our systems are giving us reasonably accurate projections. And that's where it takes you to the next year, where £11 million gap at the moment is not a sort of something to frighten us. It is there, and it's a reasonably good estimate, I think, based on the assumptions we've made. And as Audit Committee, we've got to be clear that we have in place the mechanisms by which we can tackle a potential deficit, and it's a substantial one. And it's got harder and harder, as we've seen over the last few years. But now we really are facing, I think, some really difficult decisions. So I think that's just one of the conclusions I draw from that. The other worry I have is about the housing revenue account, because whereas we've got a large amount of money in the general account and we can not play tunes with it, but there's a degree of flexibility in it. In the housing revenue account, because you can't move in and out so easily, there's a real difficulty there. And it goes to a point that Gilbert was raising earlier about energy. We want to be actually investing in our housing earlier rather than later, and yet the whole way in which the risks bear down on the housing revenue account create a real problem. So I think that's one area. And the other is this long-running send issue, which really is a sort of further pressure on our budgets, and is not something we can do much about. We're being pulled one way by the legislation and a desire to meet people's needs, on the other, a lack of funding. So I think that I just highlight those areas of risks for us to think about some of the implications of what Ian's talked about. So, any points? Yes, Ian.
Firstly, just real congratulations on this budget. It's just wonderful. I know £2 million is a lot of money to many people, but in strict corporate terms, this is really, really quite good. So congratulations to yourself and to Cabinet Lead. In fact, previous Cabinet Lead as well had much to do with it, Councillor Renison, of course. Just had a couple of questions. One was actually, I'm sorry to pick you up on this, but it's just because I'm coming a bit fresh to this, as it were, is that you used a lot of acronyms. And for instance, if you could tell me, and because members of the public are watching, don't they? Of course, like RCCO, ASC, and OFP. I wasn't too sure what any of those were. And then I just wondered, sorry to pick you up on that, but
very good point, Ian.
You have to be transparent to the public. And just to, if you could just give a little bit more of an explanation about the COVID-19 gap and how that's worked as well, because that seems like we've actually managed to make a surplus there, which I'm very interested in how we managed to do that.
Can we take a group question? I think they're both very good points. Just to add your point about congratulating him, when I said they're accurate, we ought to say not only were they accurate, but well done, because a lot of people have not been able to project as effectively. Yes.
Thanks. Just on the bad debts, what's the direction of travel on that? Is it going to increase, or have we hit rock bottom with that? What's your view on that or feeling?
Great. Any other points to make before we move on? Yes.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, obviously the set figure is still a staggering, eye-watering figure, not only our councils, which you mentioned, cost-management council, but then you've got a role of cost-management councils. How do you see the direction of travel in that? Where's it going to land? What's going to happen and what factors?
Thanks, good point. Thanks, Margaret. Any other points to Ian? Right, could you pick those points up, Ian?
Yes, certainly. So thank you for that question and those points, Councillor Rathbone. I think it's a learning lesson for us all presenting live and doing it. Obviously, we're doing it now in sort of a hybrid fashion, I guess, in a way, aren't we? So yes, we will make sure in future presentations we correct any issues with it.
You want to just say what they are?
Very quickly, the OFP is the overall financial position. So it's a report which Councillor Chapman brings to Cabinet each month, and is a report which I believe we look to circulate, or had been circulated, certainly to all members of Audit Committee in the previous municipal year, and apologies if that hasn't come through to everyone in the current cycle. We're just, well, I guess the simple reason for that is we won't have completed one yet, because we're in the process of getting one through for this Cabinet session. So that's the first one. RCCO is a term, revenue contribution to capital outlay. So again, that's just where the revenue budget funds capital expenditure. And ASC is adult social care expenditure. So hopefully that answers that part of the question. In terms of the COVID surplus, I think what we were very clear on at the outset of the pandemic was making sure that we categorised our expenditure as clearly as we could. So we looked to make sure, as part of the monitoring exercise, that we were very disciplined in clearly identifying what was generally due to COVID and what was due to non-COVID factors. Now, I think it's pretty fair to say that in the case of some areas of expenditure, it's quite a blurred line. Obviously, we have got a number of pressures that are non-COVID that we're having to grapple with. And obviously, ultimately, when we pull together all of the accounts, it's a aggregated figure. So that's basically where we've got to with that figure. Just by way of reminder, and what we included in previous presentations is an indication of, and I think probably sitting here, maybe not a year ago, 13 or 14 months ago, or sitting here virtually, at that time we were forecasting something of the order of £60 million plus in terms of a gap broadly. And that was before any indication of levels of support from government, i.e. grant, of which we've now had 4 tranches of funding, and also clarification of what a compensation for loss of sales fees and charges would look like as well, which now we have got, and we've completed a number of returns this year, and we've just finalised our final return of the year. So we're just waiting for that to be effectively verified and signed off, which is ultimately what gets us to the outturn forecast here. In addition to that, we also had clarity about how we account for basically what I'd call the income streams in relation to business rates and council tax. And so what we've been able to do is spread some of that deficit over future years again. So that has been part of the reduction, if you like, in the shift from what we were forecasting here, which was quite eye-watering, of over £60 million now down to where we are now. But I wouldn't underestimate, the work that's gone into making sure that's there. And I'm really grateful, particularly to my teams who've really, Jackie, Deirdre, Naeem, James, Russell, Simon, Reza, and I could go on. It's been a fantastic team effort, but it's also been an effort that's been done very much in partnership with all the main directorates. Everyone's pulled together and really shown a really encouraging, from my perspective, interest in sound financial management, recognising that it really enables the council to deliver all the aspirations which I know members in this chamber all have with borough residents. So that was the first question. Does that answer your points, Councillor?
That does, thank you very much. I do remember the 60 million, actually.
Frighten the horses, isn't it?
It worried me as well.
Yeah. But just again, congratulations to all the teams. I see it is a team effort, and I've seen council officers working together and seeing some of the results of that. I mean, I just think it's been amazing that we went here, particularly after the cyber attack. Just incredible effort by all of the teams.
I'll make sure that message is relayed. In terms of bad debts, can I just clarify which specific income streams you're particularly interested in, or was it just a general?
This is general, like business rates, council tax, housing revenue collection. I don't know if you can lump them all together, or you have to talk about specific.
So I would say, if I take council tax first, obviously council tax is a tax on all residents in the borough, and it affects people in different ways depending upon which band of property they're in, whether they are the sole residents of the property in terms of being eligible for single person discount, and whether they're in receipt of CTRS, council tax reduction scheme support. And then the percentage or the amount of council tax that they pay. Obviously their personal circumstances equally play into that. If they've been unfortunately made redundant or put on furlough, that has an impact upon ability to pay and all those things. So up until the point of the cyber attack, and following our ability in August to recommence recovery action, or what I would call reminder action, and implementing the aspirations within our one approach to corporate debt, we did see collection rates start to recover. People do respond to the sort of gentle nudging that we have in terms of encouraging people to make sure they do get into payment. I recognise people have immensely busy lives, and sometimes, particularly in the midst of a global pandemic, when you're having to not only work from home but look after youngsters at home, how difficult that becomes. And so we were very keen to make sure that where people may, as does happen, forgotten, we encourage them to pay. And that continued, and we were making good progress. And actually, given the overall social economic demographic of the borough compared to what I saw from other councils, we were on a par with that. Obviously, the impact of the cyber attack has significantly impacted not only our ability to support people who've got into arrears, but also our ability to issue bills to people who've moved into the borough or subject to a change of circumstance. So it is the case that our overall bad debt provision, particularly in relation to council tax, but also in relation to housing rents, has deteriorated more than trend, for want of a better word. And I think the rationale, the logic for that follows because of the cyber attack. On business rates, the position is has similar aspects to it, but of course the amount of support businesses received throughout the pandemic has been extensive. You'll be familiar, I'm sure, with all the reliefs that were granted. So an awful lot of our business rate payers actually now have a zero bill for the previous financial year, and a lot of them for the first quarter of the current financial year, or where they haven't got a zero rated bill, they're effectively receiving significant amounts of business rate relief overlaid with business grants. And I think you've probably seen or received information from the revenues team through Councillor Chapman, through Councillor Nicholson, about fantastic support the council's given to business over this period. We're talking over £100 million of supports being basically the paid out or applied to bills by a team whose normal business is collecting income. So it's been quite a culture change for some of them. So that's where we are with that, but it is something we're monitoring very closely, and obviously as part of the accounts final process, we'll be making sure it's very clear in any reports we bring forward what the impact on our bad debts has been and the various provisions. Councillor Gordon, in relation to your question on SEND, I was looking only yesterday at the figures in terms of the SEND outturn for 2020-21 with the team, and what's clearly coming through is the fact that pressure that we've been forecasting at Audit Committee, updating at Scrutiny Panel, is continuing. We're forecasting, as we had been for a while, around £5 million in terms of overspend pressure on that area, which is at one level encouraging that we're managing to maintain the growth in the overspend on a par with what we've seen in previous years. And certainly from what I've seen across London, that's consistent with what directions of travel are coming forward. A concern which I have, and has been flagged through Directors of Children's Services and Borough Treasurers, is that there's probably an awful lot of pent-up demand in the system now because of the fact that an awful lot of youngsters won't have received the education that they would normally have done. And I think we've just got, as a nation, got to brace ourselves for making sure that's properly resourced, and that the necessary arrangements to enable people to catch up for that lost year is actually properly resourced. Because as we know, if you don't invest in education, it has a much longer term impact. I'm sure there'll be a lot of lobbying in that space going on in other places as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thanks. One last one from Gilbert here.
In terms of the revenue tax, I know you're pretty far in line with Central Powers. Is there scope doing borrowing in the HRA, or is there any scope in terms of borrowing through the general fund?
So ultimately, any borrowing there's no free money. Capital requires us to be able to make sure we can finance any borrowing. So obviously within the housing revenue account, we've got a really ambitious programme to build more council houses, and also to make sure that we maintain and invest in our existing housing stock, because it's really important that we don't just let our existing stock deteriorate. And obviously there will be a lot of work to be done to catch up some of the work that had to be paused due to the pandemic. So within the overall budget for my financial years, right, 21-22, there is of course provision for borrowings and for the deployment either of taking out additional borrowing or for funding revenue contributions to capital. So the answer is yes, and obviously within the general fund, where it is possible, where it can be afforded, so where we can afford what I call the mortgage payments, for want of a better word, if that provision is there and we've got the resources to do that, we would look to do it. So there might be investor save schemes that would actually have a reasonable payback period, that would pass the sort of test of affordability, sustainable and prudent. We would obviously look at those and have done that for a number of years.
Great. Okay, I'm just conscious of the time. We can move on to the final part of this.
So very quickly, 2019-20 accounts. As you'll be all familiar, or certainly members of the committee who were on audit in the previous municipal year will be aware of the fact that our audit opinion now is still outstanding for that financial year, which is very disappointing, I have to say. There have been further delays to the opinion on the accounts following our update at the April Audit Committee meeting. The Mazars team notified us, commencing the 24th of May, that they were still undertaking works in relation to some property valuations, and this work is underway with the council valuation team. We had, as you'll recall, at the September meeting, a value for money opinion that had effectively been signed off, subject to the conclusion of the accounts work, which awaited two things which at that time were outside of our control: information from the auditors of the London Pension Fund Authority, and also clarification of a statutory instrument from in relation to DSG deficits, of which neither, from my perspective, were an issue for us, but I can just about understand why the auditors had to wait for those. Unfortunately, then the cyber attack hit, which has compromised the auditor's ability to sign off the value for money statement, and it has also then led to further work having to be done on the accounts, looking at valuations and assets, which, as we all know, is driven more by what's going on in the private sector audit market rather than in local government, given the private sector assets can be leveraged against. Turning to the 2021 accounts, as reported in April, there'd been further changes to the audit regime, for want of a better word, for when councils have to post their accounts. So in normal times, whatever they were, we would have to have got our accounts signed off by the 30. I would have to have signed the accounts off by the end of May, and for a number of years we've been successfully doing that. That's been extended because of COVID and COVID-related issues, particularly around valuations, to 1st of August. With the impact of the cyber attack and having had to effectively rebuild our asset register, we've got to be realistic about the practicalities of doing that, and also undertaking the significant reconciliation works that are needed. So it is not going to be possible for us to hit the 1st of August. What we are doing is updating and reconciling all of our key source systems. We're making sure all the necessary documentations that can be retrieved from legacy drives are done. And we're also putting in place alternative and mitigating plans where we need to provide additional financial information to support, in essence, the production of the statement of accounts, not what I would call the management accounts. We're working closely with our external auditors to make sure that our progress against the revised closing timetable is being monitored, and that includes finalising the capital outturn, revenue accruals. So again, just for clarity for people who aren't familiar with that term, an accrual is effectively where you've incurred either expenditure or income, but haven't yet got the cash or the expenditure out the door. And key tasks continue to be making sure that what we need from our systems is recovered. Work closely with Lucy, who's on the call, and her team to get this process done as quickly as possible. And Chair, we'll keep you, as we have done throughout, with Councillor Chapman, fully updated of this, and obviously through that the rest of the committee as well. So I'm happy to pause for questions there.
Great. Okay. Anyone? Any points? I mean, the concern I have is that I have your authority as a committee to sign the accounts off. That, and from what I can see so far, and Lucy, you can help us on this, that what is in question is not the accounts themselves, it's the checking of the information that went into them needs to be validated in areas that we believe are not material. So I think that our view of the accounts is still robust, but the fact that we've not been able to close them off now over a year after the year was over is a real question mark over their utility, because they're just beginning to become a historic document. And I'm worried, instead of having them within 3 months, 3 or 4 months of the year's end, which has been our traditional accountability mechanism back to the people of Hackney. Look, we've run your accounts, they've been checked. We don't have that reassurance at the moment. I do commend the Finance Department's use of, at least we can get a report, hopefully, very soon after the year end, in the next 3 months, from the management accounts, but they are not the same thing as having an independent oversight of them. So I guess, Lucy, I don't know if you're able to reassure us about whether the last year's accounts can be finally signed off, and secondly, any points about that we're not going to be a year hence talking the same way about the 2021 accounts.
Thank you, and it is very frustrating that we do find ourselves in this position. Am I really echoing? Sorry if I am. I think part of the issue is that we set our materiality level, our financial materiality level, and levels of expenditure, which are clearly very much outweighed by the value of the balance sheet. So where we are questioning valuation is potentially material in terms of benchmark of expenditure, and really taking into account the value of the balance sheet. And a lot of London boroughs are in very similar positions, just as the way that the councils are structured. We are working with the finance team to get this done as soon as possible. In terms of the 2021 audit, I think we can underestimate how unique this audit will be. There's a lot of work to be done on systems, as Rob and Ian have alluded to. So we just want to make sure that we have the right information and we're setting the right risks, and we are working very closely to do that. But I'm not really at a point where we can assess the time scale at this point, I would say.
Chair.
I couldn't hear very little of that, I must say. Yeah.
Understand.
Can anyone help? Because I'm in a similar position.
So I think what Lucy was trying to explain was that the additional work that's been undertaken in the 1920 account is on items on the balance sheet, which, when you look at those in totality, are material versus what their materiality level is, which is around the 2 million mark. But actually, it's not. If you was a reader of the accounts, sorry, it's not 2 million, it's 20 million. If you was a reader of the accounts and you looked at the totality of assets, actually 20 million, one way or the other, wouldn't make much difference to your interpretation of those accounts. But that 20 million is based on the fact that actually, if that was in the income and expenditure account, and you had a £20 million deficit, for example, when you should have had break even, then that would be a big factor. So that's why it seems not significant, but it is material in terms of provide an opinion on the accounts. So that work is underway with the finance department in terms of those valuations. On the 2021 accounts, I think what Lucy is saying is it's quite difficult for them to plan when they're able to give an opinion, because at this stage there's still some recovery work needs to happen which enables us to produce the accounts. So earlier on, for example, Rob was talking about the academy system, the housing benefits system, council tax and NNDR. Well, there's still work to be done on those to enable us to reconcile those systems in order for us to produce the accounts. So again, sort of in that respect, Lucy and her team are quite dependent on the council's ability to produce those accounts and those reconciliations. I hope that's a summary.
Excellent, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I must say we've got to find a better way to make this system work, because these are very important matters. And if we can't hear properly, then we can't do our job. So I think, but anyway, let's carry on. Any other points on the accounts? Yeah.
One quick question. So this signing off the accounts for 2020 to 2021, will it have an impact on the delay of the accounts from 21 to 22? That would lag that impact on the delivery?
Potentially, if it's not signed off, if the 2021 accounts, so the ones that we'll be preparing now, aren't signed off, there would inevitably be. I think I would just put it into context, if it didn't come across from what Lucy was saying, was that actually there's still a significant number of boroughs, councils across the country who don't have the cyber attack to deal with, who still haven't got their accounts signed off. And I know there are a number of London boroughs still haven't had their, let me get my financial years right, 2018-19 accounts signed off as well. So that's not to say any of us in this room, on this side of the room, are happy with the situation, but it's contextual, and it really does reflect some of the things we've reported to this committee previously, that the whole public sector local government audit piece has for a number of years been really creaking in terms of how it's resourced, and also how it has to adhere to the private sector's accounting standards, and in particular deal with issues that have arisen in the private sector from either downright directors not doing the right thing to misvaluations in terms of assets to try and either manipulate profits, all of things which we just don't impact on our accounts. So we could see, for instance, a £20 million change in the value of this building. It has no impact on the council's overall resource base because of what it is. Our asset base is something like £3.5 billion, to put it into context. So as you can see, Councillor Rathbone doing the maths in terms of what decimal places that is, it's big. But unfortunately, because the auditors are scored against a very clear checklist by the Financial Reporting Council, it would be the partners of the firms who would get fined if they haven't provided sufficient documentation. So that is a driving factor of the situation we find ourselves in.
And it is a potential hole. I mean, I agree. It's a real difficult, because the basic accountability and knowledge of forward budgeting depends on being confident about where you are. And to me, this crisis in public sector in public sector audit is a direct result of the abolition of the District Audit Service, and then the construction of the destruction of the Audit Commission. So there's no specialist understanding the sort of issues that Ian's just referred to. And so you got a clash of public accountability on the one hand and this rush to privatisation on the other. And I think what we're seeing here is the results of that. And it's a real danger, in my view, to public accountability. Anyway, before I sound off, any other points about this? Okay, shall we move on then? Thanks, Ian. Next item was we're going to do the deep dive review, and I think this is appropriate just to introduce it. Jackie's going to just summarise it if you want to get your slides.
Yeah, I've lost my internet connection at just the wrong time. So
All right. Andrew, can you do this? Great. Yeah, this is just for context. We've had a discussion, and I've let committee members know about the ideas as they developed about having a deep dive onto the COVID recovery being the thing that we should really be clear about whether we are in good shape to do it. And very helpfully, Jackie's got a presentation about suggesting how we might go about this.
So I'm just going to go through the background to why we're potentially looking at the response to COVID-19 as part of a deep dive, and then to go into a little bit more detail about the areas or the scope of that review, and how we might take that forward as an audit committee and through a workshop, an idea of several workshops which we've undertaken before in relation to previous deep dives, and the timetable for that. So back in April, the Audit Committee was provided with an overview of the impact of COVID-19, the Council response and plans for recovery. There's a link to that document in the slide presentation. I think it was all sent before the committee, so if you want to have a look at it in more detail, it's there. Clearly, the COVID recovery is key to the Council's finances. As was mentioned earlier in the evening, we know how much COVID is costing us. We know we've got government funding for this year, for last year, part of this year. We don't know what we've got going forward, so it's really important that we continue to recover in an effective and efficient way. It's proposed that the review takes the form of 3 workshops undertaken between now and October, with a report coming to Audit Committee in October. So moving on, so the original document identified a number of potential key lines of inquiry which the Audit Committee could look at. And after discussions with the chair, 3 areas were selected to focus on. The first one was around restarting services following restrictions being lifted, either in part or in full. And it's not just restarting services that stopped. That's looking at how services were adapting and being delivered differently, and what has changed since those lockdown arrangements are easing, pending obviously whatever the announcements are in relation to the 21st of June. We also wanted to look at progress in implementing new ways of working, recognising that people have been working from home for a period of time, and how we're taking the lessons learned from that and moving into a sort of workforce strategy, which is almost like the new normal in a post-COVID world. And finally, there was a look at the adult learning services. Some of you will be aware the adult learning services has recently merged with the wider employment skill service of the council, and it has a key role to play in terms of COVID recovery, and particularly in supporting our residents into work.
Absolutely.
So moving on, in terms of restarting council services, clearly we're not in a position to do a deep dive of all services, so we've suggested some specific areas here, and obviously the ideas are welcome. The 3 areas we've suggested is around harnessing the huge amount of community support that was harnessed during the COVID period, and how we're capturing that and using that going forward. I think that's really important, that we don't lose all that which we've gained during that period. Obviously, with services have faced significant challenges, none more so probably than some of our adult social care services. And I think, as Ian mentioned in the earlier presentation, that's been where there's been a huge increase in costs over the year. So I think that's quite an important area to look at. And finally, it's youth services, because youth services have had to adapt to different modes of delivery during the period, so more online delivery, etc., etc. And again, it's sort of what lessons have learned from that, and what are the delivery plans going forward, bearing in mind those changes. So that's just sort of 3 examples across the council. So moving on, in terms of new ways of working and workforce strategy. So basically, this is looking back, as I said, looking at lessons learned from COVID working. What have we learned? What do we want to keep? What do we want to throw away? And what opportunities are there? An overview of what our planning processes are for coming out of COVID-19 and coming out of lockdown in terms of how we come back to work, obviously pending those announcements for 21st of July. What the opportunities and challenges are in relation to new ways of working, and how they feed into our workforce strategies. The final slide, or the final area, looks at adult learning and employment skills and COVID recovery. As I said, sort of an overview of the service integration and how performance has changed since that integration, plus the impact of COVID-19, and also how that service is responding to COVID recovery, and how they're going to contribute to the need to help our local residents into work and to help the recovery of the local economy. So in terms of work programme and timetable, as I said, we're anticipating 3 workshops, 1 in July, 1 in August, 1 in September. Now, obviously, we need more than finance colleagues for these meetings, so we anticipate inviting people from directors who've got a more sort of hands-on experience of those services that we're looking at. So they'll be sort of quite wide sessions, and then we'll come to a session in September where we'd look at sort of conclusions and recommendations from that work. with an aim of a report to October Audit Committee, pending obviously completion of the work. That's it really. That's the
great. Thanks very much. Hope just really canvass whether we're members' views about whether we got it on. I think the sort of themes I pick out are what COVID has done is to reveal a whole range of new needs, and those will be ones that particularly in more vulnerable groups that have been thrown up, and there'll be real service challenges in reaching those. Equally, there are some real opportunities here. We've got new ways of working, and particularly the idea of bringing the community more closely involved. In other words, new forms of service delivery that involve more of the community, really trying to build on the pluses that came out of the COVID, the COVID reaction. And then a concentration particularly on young people and adult learning as being people who are either jobs are disappearing or skills are being reworked, trying to provide support out to the community to try and meet those type of challenges. So that's embedded in this idea of actually coming out of this with a really positive plan for the future, rather than just either trying to get back to where we were or not thinking about the opportunities. So that was the sort of theme, and I really value members' participation in this. I mean, we would do it not in a meeting like this, but probably do it online to talk to officers about how they are proposing to go about it, and their plans. So any views about the direction or the detail? Yes, Anna.
It's Councillor Lynch. I really welcome this, Jackie. I think this is great, and I think for me the two things that come out of this is that it actually reflects what's happening within sort of what's happening nationally. And the two things that I wanted to just point out, which I think is really useful for it to feed into, is when you're looking at the sort of COVID recovery of adult health and social care, there's obviously a huge piece of wider work that's happening at the systems level as well, with the ICB and other pieces of work that's happening around North East London and what that's going to look like in terms of the workforce. It's obviously going to be system by default in terms of how we're going to be delivering place-based health and social care for residents, and I think that's something that would be really interesting to look at how what we could do internally and happy to be prepared for those conversations coming up in the future around sort of deployment of workforces across the system. And my second question is, I don't know if it's relevant to this piece of work, but I just noticed in I think it's the Q4 Audit Committee report on page 38. I mentioned I brought this up previously, and I'm sure Interim Chief Exec Ian Williams will be aware that this is something that I know he's got concerns around. Is the percentage of employees we've got over 50 or over, and I'm just aware that that's increasing by quite regularly till 20. We've now got sort of nearly 40.7%. And actually, I think there's got to be a recognition that these employees as well have probably been those ones that have been at the front line of this. So this is our refuse collectors that kept collecting our bins, and the people that kept our, kept getting stores clean, all those people that are in those sort of more front-facing manual employment sectors within the council. And I just wondered whether or not there's something around what we're doing to succession plan that, and whether or not, as you said, is there something about those things that we haven't had to do, can we stop doing them in terms of services going forward? Has there, I'm very aware of how risk averse we can sometimes be with sort of stopping and doing things differently. Have we been able to reflect on what actually what went wrong? Did anything go horrifically wrong that would mean that we would have to keep things going?
Great, thanks for that. Any other points? Yes, Gilbert.
I've just been feeding into a general post-COVID recovery plan. In general, the council will be looking at some point. Is that post-COVID recovery? Did you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a good challenge bag. That's not the role of the Audit Committee, obviously, to prepare it. What it's trying to do is to investigate how people are. But I agree, I mean, there could well be an outcome in which we seek a kind of an overview with some principles, and actually challenge the executive to think about having such a plan. So I think it's a good point. So Ian or Jackie, do you want to come back on Anna's point?
Councillor, I think on the point you made about the ICBO, it's a really good point, and we will build that into scope. I would say that I think that because we've been quite ahead of the curve in terms of that integration work, I think that really showed when sort of COVID hit in, and there was all the issues around obviously discharge planning and making sure that the people were discharged from hospital, there was room for COVID patients. I think that really kicked in because we already had those relationships built. So that seemed to be a positive. I think that could, when we're sort of further scoping out, that can be factored in. In terms of the workforce 50 plus, again, I think that's probably something we can consider as part of that workforce element of the review, and how that's going to be impacting our workforce strategy going forward, and the differences potentially, I suppose, of the impacts of determining on age, on home working, etc. I think that can be factored in.
Ian, do you want to pick up?
And just to build upon the point Jackie made around workforce, you're absolutely right, Councillor Lynch, about the statistics around over 50, but actually I'm very conscious of the fact that we've got figures over 55 and over 60 and over 65 are equally as challenging. So it's very much something that I've been keen to make sure we address in the refreshed workforce strategy. An awful lot of work went into putting in place a council workforce strategy pre-pandemic and getting that all worked through, working very closely with Councillor Williams and the rest of the cabinet members. But actually now we're in to where we are now, we now need to look at that even more closely. And only, I think it was last week, at the senior leadership group, we did a big piece on succession planning and just how that can work. Not an easy task, as I'm sure all members in the room are aware. It's very important that succession planning is inclusive and doesn't give the appearance of favouritism, but it is something that we desperately need to progress, and we are really looking closely at it. So into Councillor Smythe's question, you'll recall that back in July 2020, we brought a refreshed corporate, the Mayor and Cabinet brought a refreshed corporate plan to July's council meeting and through the Cabinet, and that was really recognising the impact of what we'd seen in the period since the corporate plan had been agreed only a few months before. We are currently in the process of working again now to update that and refresh that, and I believe the intention is to bring an updated corporate plan and strategies through to full council in February. So as you'd expect, an awful lot of engagement work is now going to be undertaken. I would envisage that this piece of work would feed into some of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is this initiative itself is a feed in to that, and ensures that we can play a kind of checking role on how things are going and how robust things are actually on the ground. And I think that's where I would hope people would participate in this dialogue with officers in particular areas that we can pick up.
Some plans, Chair, have been published by local authorities already, namely Bradford, Cambridge, Gloucester, Harrow, Newcastle, Norwich, Alderton, Cheshire West, Chester, Derbyshire. These places have actually already formulated their post recovery plan. So they are well ahead of them.
Good. Okay, Ian.
Yeah, so just ask. Sorry, I might have missed it. Is that how far will this deep dive cover, as it were, public health and spending within public health and how that's happened? Will it be covering that area at all? I'm particularly thinking about some controversial things like PPE and stuff like this.
Not directly, I'd say, because there was a number of sort of suggested key lines of inquiry, and we had to pick out sort of several. So it is actually a deep dive. So not directly. I expect that we'll touch on it and look when we look at the sort of the adult social care and for example, what are the plans going forward in relation to on the demand for PPE and the arrangement for that, etc. So that there will be sort of, tangentially there'll be some sort of relationship between that, but not directly, I'd say.
But I think we are up for a suggestion about a line of further addition to it. So members very, very welcome to make a contribution if they feel it should be covered. Okay, can we then move on? Thanks for that, and we'll take forward and come up with some proposals for dates. performance review, which is the paper which is, I don't know, is Bruce are you going to present?
Not necessarily, Chair. I think that's such a wide range.
Yeah. Yes, I know. We picked up most of the points, haven't we? Yeah.
The main points already across Scott's, Ian's, Jackie's contributions. You've picked up on the main areas around income challenges, etc. So.
Yes. Just so. Yeah, so there are the one area I thought we might have a contribution from is on the housing side of things, and I'm hoping David Padfield is A, still there, and B, can talk a little bit about the issue on repairs, how we're reacting on those, and some of the real problems we alluded to earlier about the housing revenue account and the management of it. David, are you on the line?
I am indeed. Hopefully you'll hear me okay. I'll pick things up in that order. Oh, am I echoing?
You are, but you're at least hearable. I couldn't hear what Lucy was saying, but at least I can hear.
Okay, good. I'll carry on talking. So on repairs, the big hit to repairs has really been during the lockdown periods. We restricted repairs to emergency repairs only. We're now coming out of that. And we're doing the majority of repairs at the moment, and hopefully before too long we will have a full repairs service implemented. There are some concerns about what the size of the pent-up backlog out there is, but so far we seem to be coping with that fairly well, and we're reasonably confident of being able to cope with that going forward. One of the things that is highlighted in this report is around some of the satisfaction data and some of the right first time fix data, and obviously our ability to collect and analyse that data has been quite badly hit by the cyber attack, but we've got some quite good workarounds in place, and hopefully we're well on our way to being able to have full data on those things. You've already talked a lot tonight around some of the bad debt issues and some of the financial challenges of COVID and the cyber attack. Obviously the HRA rent arrears position is very concerning because of the rate at which it's increased. Obviously we're not alone. If you look at the social housing sector generally, during the pandemic, rent arrears have kind of doubled across the sector. Our performance is slightly worse than that, but that balance between those two figures, and probably a bit more than that besides, can be accounted for by the added burden of the cyber attack that we've had. There's also, I should highlight, a little bit of uncertainty about our current figures because of the cyber attack. We've had to make some assumptions around housing benefit. We're again reasonably confident that it's accurate, but there is still some work going on around housing benefit, and also, as was alluded to by an earlier contribution, I think it was Rob, in terms of reconciling all of the figures across the various temporary workarounds that we've had to implement. That's been a very large piece of work, and hopefully we're getting quite close to the end of that. And then the final thing I'll highlight on these figures, I think I last came along to Audit Committee probably back in October to talk about our voids figures. And I think that was probably a couple of days after the cyber attack, and I was probably massively underestimating what a burden that cyber attack would be. So we've continued to have a lot of problems in void turnaround, largely as a result of the pandemic, which I talked about last time, but now increasingly as a result of the cyber attack as well. And a third factor as well is because of reaching contract spend limits. We've had to sort of change some of the contractors that we use for void work, which has caused some additional disruption. But for both rents and voids, we've got comprehensive recovery plans in place. And hopefully, as we start to move out of the pandemic and start to recover from the cyber attack, we will start to improve on both of those figures before too long.
In this area very well, and it is a real concern, and certainly I'd like to keep reports from you, how well the program that you've just set out is actually performing over the next month. So I would hope that in October we could have again an update on the HRA progress. Any points on other points on performance? Great. Okay. Thanks again, David. And let's look forward to seeing you with an update in October, I think. Right, the next item is the Treasury Management Update.
Yeah.
Hi, Philippe.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. I hope everyone is hear me clearly. It's a bit echoey, I think.
I'm not hearing you, actually.
No. Can you hear me now? No.
I can't hear Nick now. Is that something gone wrong?
I think I've got a feeling Nick's exited the meeting from the looks of things.
I can't.
No, he's not there.
Now we all. Ian, do you want to just sort of highlight? No, he's back.
Here we go.
Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Okay, thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. Right, so Treasury Management Update for this Audit Committee covers Treasury activities over the period April to May 21. So what I'm going to quickly summarize the whole report, and I'm going to go to the investments. So looking at the report, looking at the investment balances end of May, but we had investment balance of 105 million, which was about compared to the 69 million at the start of April 21. The slight increase in the investment balance is mainly due to the start of the new cycle of grants coming in, and that's a normal new thing. We get money coming in, so the position changes. Moving on to the borrowing position, there is no major changes on the borrowing since the last update. There's no new borrowings done. In terms of the credit quality of our investment, Chair, we have maintained again the quality of the investments between A+ and A. And the only thing I have to say, the council, the team continues to pay close attention to the council's cash flow, making sure there's enough liquid cash to meet the unexpected situation as a result of the ongoing pandemic. That was a quick summary of the whole report. As I said, there's no major change from the last update, which was in end of April, and I'm happy to take any questions.
You just outlined the as we move into being a borrower, then we become much more exposed to risk, and we need to keep an eye on that side of things. So thanks for that. Let's move on then. Corporate Risk Register Review. Who's going to introduce?
So, Chair, if I just do a very quick introduction and particularly thank Matt for pulling together all of the information in relation to this. As you all know, Matt, that's our corporate risk manager and does a fantastic piece of work in making sure that not only the corporate risk register, but also the directorate risk together. This risk register here has been reviewed by the corporate management team pre 31st of May, and obviously we keep it under continual review, and what this report looks to do is summarise some of the changes that have happened, but also highlights the key risks. So I'll hand over to Matt now to just pull out some of the highlights. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Ian.
Yep, go ahead.
Let me know if it's sounding muffled. So as Ian just said, this version was signed off by HMT in May. And there are clear changes and developments since it was last reviewed in full by committee, which was in January. Inevitably, the register still heavily features COVID-19 and the cyber attack, and the impacts of both are still being felt. With the pandemic, although the situation is now undoubtedly better than in January, extremely serious challenges remain, particularly with regards to the council's financial position, future funding and budgets. Also, there remain current uncertainties about new strains, further waves, vaccine hesitancy, and even long COVID. So risks relating to this will need to be reviewed at the highest level and managed for a good while yet.
Risks arising from last October's cyber attack remain. Because of substantial progress made with the recovery, there was discussion about whether this could be subsumed with the other more overarching cybersecurity risk. But Rob Miller still felt that it needed separate coverage, with some vulnerabilities still remaining and ongoing risks relating to the data breach, which occurred in January of this year. As was alluded to in the action points at the start of this meeting, at the last meeting in April, 2 risks in particular were asked about. One related to workforce on page 15 of the risk register, and one relating to climate change on page 34 of the register. Obviously, the full descriptions within the corporate register give proper context, but I thought I'd just summarise both of those risks because they were of particular interest last time. So the workforce risk essentially has 2 angles, one of which relates to pressures on staff in recent times, especially with the pandemic, also recent senior leadership changes, restructures, and increasing financial pressures on all services and resources. The other angle of this workforce risk is about the risk of the council not utilising or maximising the potential of new technologies and IT opportunities. Also, the cyber attack has added to this, but it seems so far the council have adapted really well. Also, obviously, the pandemic has forced home working and a reliance on these technologies, but at this stage, such risks relating to that haven't materialised. And obviously, HR are playing a key role in managing risks relating to this. Finally, the climate change risk. The angle here was that in light of ambitious targets for carbon reductions, the expectation of change required might not be matched by the available capital and resources. That is broadly the risk. But happily, consensus is that Hackney at this stage is doing well, hence the lack of a high rating, with things such as Hackney Light and Power, lower traffic neighbourhoods, school streets, green fleets. This is all evidence, obviously, of the council taking steps in the right direction, but it is obviously still very early in the journey. And the Environment Bill 2021 at the moment, which is being finalised, is going to place even more responsibility. So this will remain a challenge for years, decades ahead. So yeah, I think that summarises the main points in this iteration. But any questions?
Just a minor point, and we've mentioned, as Tim Shields and Anne Canning left because they're responsible officers in some of these categories, and I just wonder if they've been replaced. That's just a little minor point, but
yeah, absolutely. They were at the time of this sort of reviews and at the time of signed off, they were still in positions.
Who was Tim Shields anyway? I can't remember.
No, I mean, it's a good point. Yeah. Margaret.
Thanks, Chair. What I'd like to have to meet is in relation to temporary accommodation, 30 on this register. The data goes back to September 2020 due to the cyber attack. Obviously, a lot has happened since then. A number of other factors which were affecting the homelessness figures in terms of accommodation. I don't know whether you've got any sort of thoughts about that. Whether it's accurate.
So, Ian.
So I think what I can say is that you'll know that Rob, Jennifer, Marcia and the team working really intensively at the moment in relation to temporary accommodation. What we have got challenges with is some of the data, as we've rehearsed a few times. What I can do is maybe arrange a session on that more specifically to make sure that we can give you the necessary assurances about the data that we do hold. So, for example, I have seen and do see regularly data in relation to where our temporary accommodation cohorts are residing, and whilst we have that data in workaround formats, it's not in the formats we've had previously because of the cyber attack. But I know the team will be happy to do an update on that, and if you leave that with me, Chair, I'll get a briefing on that and to address Councillor Gordon's point, and we won't wait until the next audit committee. We'll get that pulled together quickly because I recognise the importance of the issue and the assurances that you're after.
Yeah, and obviously, I'm sure everyone's got a lot of concern about people being kept out of their children,
Great. I mean, one of the concerns I hope, having heard on the climate, is this business that we were talking about earlier about having a costed plan. Because I think the initiatives that we're currently carrying out are fine, but put in the context of trying to get to net zero within 2 decades is an extraordinary challenge. And I think until we've got a really robust plan, that will have to remain very much in the red sector. But I was reassured today by the presentation that there was beginning to emerge a timeline, and if we can turn that into a costed plan with some funding sources attached to it, then I think it suddenly becomes much more manageable. Otherwise, I think we've covered most of the issues. We covered SEND, which I think is the sort of lurking problem that can undermine both provision and service. Cyber and COVID, I think and I think this continual reference to workforce concerns, I think, is the one that we really do have to keep an eye on. So, if that's thanks, Matt, for that. And if no other points, let's move on then to fraud and irregularity annual report, and call up Michael from the ether there. Yep, there you are. Yep.
Greetings from the ether. Can everybody hear me? Great. So this is the annual report on the outcome of investigations work that's been carried out during the last year. So first of all, I'll touch on some of the challenges to that, which are themes that have been across the evening, really. And then I'll lead on to some of the successes that the team has still managed to achieve despite all those problems, and also where I see us going in the next couple of months, next couple of weeks. So the biggest challenge to the investigations work over the year is reflected in the tenancy results, which are usually the standout financial numbers that I have to tell you about at this time of year. They have been significantly hampered because the consequence of COVID has really prevented us going into people's homes and doing that work which isn't considered essential to this point. So that has really been problematic, but there is some good news on that, which I'll come on to shortly, or some more promising news that I'll come on to shortly. The number of referrals in many areas are down. So I think that the reasons for this is that, first of all, officers of the council act as our eyes and ears and report matters of concern back to the team. So there's obviously been less council workers out in the community and noting things that are needing to be followed up. Some activities have been down just because of the nature of the pandemic. So in particular, I would note parking. There was less driving. There was perhaps less scope for some of the blue badge offences that the team look at. And then also some of the partner organisations that we work with, they have been, as have we, they have been having other priorities to deal with. So I'm thinking particularly of the DWP, and I know that their fraud teams have also been retasked with making sure that help gets to people that need it and prioritising things on that basis. So that has been a factor during the year. The other thing that I would flag, which is more of an issue going forward, is one of the consequences of the cyber attack is that we do a lot of inquiries based on the outcome from the National Fraud Initiative. So we provide our data and that gets matched across other councils and other sources of information. The timing of the cyber attack coincided with the point in the 2-year cycle where we were due to start drawing our data together and get it ready to present for the next round of the NFI. So while we have had almost 50,000 matches to keep us busy over the last year, we're currently on 10,000 matches that have come out of the most recent round of the NFI. So if things change and we get our data back, we will obviously add it into the system going forward, and that information might then become available to us. But as things stand, there is a significant gap there. So that's some of the challenges that are covered in the report. In terms of the positives that I would take away, the financial benefits of counter fraud work for the year were costed out as 2.3 million, which is half of the amount for the previous year, but is still a significant sum and was achieved against a difficult backdrop. So I am pleased that the service was at least able to deliver what I think was a sizable benefit overall. Outcomes in some areas have held up particularly well. So despite the fact that I've said there was less driving and less parking, the blue badge inquiries held up in terms of volumes and outcomes. Similarly, the no recourse to public funds work was not too far short of where it normally would be. And I was also pleased that the teams were able to adapt and pick up new areas of potential fraud, and we made some really good progress there. So in particular, there was over £300,000 worth of business grants that were not paid out following investigation. There were many thousands more grants that were matched through the NFI application earlier in proceedings, but there was a large saving to the public purse by preventing that money going out the door. We also were able to focus on some areas of the NFI that we hadn't prioritised previously, because there were more readily available things to look at that were guaranteed to deliver results. So, for example, we got £116,000 saving on CTRS matches that were reviewed through the NFI. There was also a big increase in terms of the outcomes from council tax single person discount matching that was reviewed. I'd also note that in the background, where some of the activity wasn't able to go ahead that normally would, it wasn't that cases just sat still and didn't move forward at all. The paperwork, the administration was done, and when we're able to get back into carrying out those parts of the process that were on hold, then we're in a good place, ready to move things forward quickly. Lastly, I'd note that the teams, both in investigations and also in audit, which is the next report that I'll be talking about, most of the division was redeployed at points through the year and provided value in those council services that were put into being overnight to help people when that was most urgently needed. So I'd also mention that. I mentioned that I'm hopeful for the future. My grounds for saying that is, as I said, the biggest issue I've had is the tenancy work. We have now got all staff returned from redeployments. We're in the final stages of going through the risk assessments that's necessary before staff get back to taking up those more challenging, difficult, risky roles. We want to move confidently but safely, and those steps are progressing well. And I anticipate that within weeks, and I don't think many weeks, we will be able to pick up some of that activity that has been on hold for a long time. So that's what gives me most optimism for the next quarter. At that point, I'm going to pause and take questions, with the caveat that I think some of the questions from the corner of the room that might be furthest from the mic are not coming through very clearly. So, Chair, I might need to ask you to relay anything if I can't hear it, but I'll take questions now.
Sorry, I've got several, but I'll try and limit. I was just, can you hear me okay?
Michael?
Michael, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the report. It's very important in this particular area about work. But I was just a little bit concerned about this no recourse to public funds on page 128 of my agenda, which is saying that we have a saving of £1,432,729. I don't personally feel that's a saving. I'm just wondering, I looked on page 136, which obviously describes the process, but I wondered why is it so much, and are there any procedures or anything that maybe I could be shown as to how exactly all of that is decided that somebody in fact is making a false claim to do with NRPF. Then secondly, I just wondered, I'll refer to the items, sorry. The item 7.2, business grants, says that 31 payments have been withheld. I just wondered if the businesses are told this, because I had quite a lot of casework with businesses in the borough who, as Michael's champion as well, that contacted me to say they applied for grants and they didn't get it, and there was no information about it. I'm not asking you to give an answer on that necessarily, but just to say, is there an answer about when those businesses identify that they're not going to get all the payments going to be withheld, that they are actually informed and it's, as it were, followed through? And finally, I just item 6.4, right by, and the kind of description of that. I just wondered how suspected fraudulent applications. I'm assuming that that's mainly to do with the longevity of tenancy and so on, the qualification period of that, and what exactly happens following that if it is deemed that it is to be fraudulent. Is it then, are they banned from ever applying again, or how does that work?
Great, all very pointed questions. Anyone else? And then Michael can come back on all the points. No, looks like, okay, Michael, do you want to respond to those?
Sure, thank you. Okay, so taking the NRPF point first, people who are regular attendees at these meetings, one caveat I usually give is that I never consider that the NRPF work is fraud in the common understanding of the term. It's not like a lot of other things that the team look at. We appreciate that we're dealing with people who are in a very difficult position and understandably need the council's help. And typically what we look at is exaggeration of circumstances to the point that it doesn't warrant the threshold for the council providing help. There's other sources of assistance available to people. So in terms of what we would classify as a saving there, it's not necessary. Well, it's never been the case that we have taken someone to court and proven a fraud case against them. It's more about having that robustness at the gateway to the council service, establishing if there are other means of support, and doing this with the social workers. It's part of a team effort, and quizzing people properly and identifying if they have got other means of support available to them. And if they have, then it is a sad reality that Hackney has so much money and it's directing people to get the support from those other places that they should. In terms of the amount that we calculate on that, we take an assessment that it's the year-long value of support that would have resulted. So at the time that this work began, it was the case that if someone was getting assistance from Hackney, they were typically doing so for a fair bit longer than a year. So we took that conservative measure and used that as the benchmark as a way to quantify it, which is what we have to do with the case of fraud, because by its nature it's hidden and you have to make some assessments about what the quantifiable amount is to give meaningful feedback. Moving on to the business grant situation, the typically communication with businesses that apply for assistance would be through the business grants team. But where we identify fraud concerns, I think it was almost universally the case that our inquiries would involve going back to the business and checking with them what the circumstances of the claim were. So to give you an example, we had cases where it ended up that a business that was previously an occupant of premises was putting in a claim even though they had moved away, or someone associated with the business was claiming but they weren't the person entitled to do that. So the sorts of follow-up inquiries we were doing involved talking to the legitimate business, and they would be aware that the council had concerns. Even if they weren't always framed in terms of it's a fraud concern, there was dialogue with the business in those cases, and they were aware that they maybe needed to provide more information to us, or that there was a concern. It wasn't, as far as I can recall, I don't think there were cases where anyone was left hanging as a result of a fraud investigation. There was dialogue with people. And then moving on to the right to buy question, so it's less about how long a tenant has been resident at the premises, because to be honest, we would pick that up quite quickly from the information on the tenancy systems. What we do quite often have is concerns about how the right to buy is being funded. So going back 10 years, the traditional thing there was we would have people that were on full housing benefits, and then they would apply for the right to buy, and it was how were they getting a mortgage and those sorts of concerns. It's become a bit more nuanced over the years, and there are money laundering regulations that means that Hackney has to be satisfied about the probity of funds that are being used to enter into those sorts of transactions. So it's looking at where is the money coming from, is it from legitimate sources, and there is more scrutiny as part of the application process that we've brought in over the years, so that people are asked about where the source of funds is, and if there's uncertainty, then that's followed up on, and that can lead to a further investigation, or sometimes it leads to people withdrawing their application. In terms of are they banned from making future applications, the right to buy legislation does not typically work in that way. A tenant is entitled to come back at a future point in time with a new application, and it would need to be looked at afresh. But what I would say is that we do obviously have records of previous applications and what happened on those, so we would know if there was a previous concern, and that would be a starting point for reviewing a new application. So I hope that answers the points that were raised.
You're okay, please. Yeah, great stuff. Okay, so if that nothing else on that item, we move on to the internal audit annual report.
Sure. Okay. Okay, I think the feedback's gone now, so I'll carry on. So this is the report that provides the overall audit opinion for the council's control framework. It gives that assurance each year. This has obviously not been a typical year. There has been change. Services have been started up overnight. It has been difficult to carry out the full range of audit activity that we would have liked, partly because officers were necessarily redeployed, partly because the auditees that we engage with were fully focused on the response to the pandemic, and then more latterly to the cyber attack. So there's been understandable calls on people's time, which mean that the audit plan at the start of the year looked quite different to the audit plan at the end of the year. So it was a dynamic document. There was work that came in and there was work that came out, and all of that is summarised within the report. The work that came out, some of that will not go ahead. The vast majority has been rescheduled into the current year's audit plan. Where work has not gone ahead, it has been because, as I say, there has been calls on people's resources that meant it wasn't right that the audit proceeded at the time that it had been scheduled for. And at the same time, we were also alive to the fact that there was a lot of change, there was new services, and there were some that is a source of risk to Hackney. So you'll also see that new areas of activity were covered. So in particular, there was a question earlier about should the audit deep dive look at things like PPE. So PPE was one of the issues that we did expand the audit plan to look at. So we looked at PPE, and in particular, we looked at the allocation, the procurement, and the expenditure around that. We also looked at the business grants on the audit side to look at the processes around that. There was work on business continuity, on insurance, on risk management. And in a similar vein, following the cyber attack, there's also been some advisory work from audit to look at the academy recovery. So that's the system that's used for council tax and benefits. So we've got people from the audit team sitting on that project board to look at the processes and procedures and to give an audit opinion as they're being drafted, which I think is a real benefit rather than coming along after the event. It's much better to try and contribute to getting it right first time. Obviously, there's a multidisciplinary panel that's doing that, but it's good to be part of it. So that the plan has changed over the year. We have not carried out as much work as we do in normal years. There's no hiding from that. Hackney is not alone in that. That is typical for other local authorities. It's not ideal, but it is a reflection of the realities of the last year. Nevertheless, the head of internal audit is in a position to report that the overall opinion for the year is that the control framework at Hackney is adequate, which is the key thing to take out of this report, because that will feed into the annual governance statement, and which is in turn part of the final accounts further down the line. So I'd ask you to particularly note that overall audit opinion, that the assurance framework is adequate from the work that's been undertaken and from the other assurance sources that audit will also look at in reaching that view. In terms of the outcomes on the key performance indicators, they were all met for the year. It continues to be the case that where recommendations are raised from audit work and agreed with managers, there's very good engagement with making sure that those recommendations are followed through and acted on. So that is another plus to take out of this. And I would pause at that point. And just before I pause, one other thing to note. Appendices to this report include the audit charter, which sums up audit's purpose, our authority and responsibility, and also the audit strategy, which sets out how we go about delivering the service. We ask for your approval for both of those documents. They get renewed each year, revised each year. There's not actually any changes, but they have been reviewed. So we just ask for those to be approved by committee if you're happy with those. And at that point, I will pause again and take any questions.
But it is a particular responsibility of Audit Committee to be the direct line for internal audit and indeed external audit, but internal audit in particular. So we have a particular responsibility to ensure that we have reviewed the compliance, as Michael said, with the general rules. And I have to say, I'm really pleased, given the pressures of the last year, about the positive report that we were compliant. And I think it says a lot about the culture of Hackney and the commitment of officers that we can give such a positive view despite the pressures of the last year. And following that, the other point that you've made about that where we have done the audits, we are still seeing performance up there, mostly in the green. So I think that should reassure us from our point of view as a committee that Hackney remains a compliant borough with the rules. So I was reassured by that. So, members, any questions? Yes, Gilbert.
Chair, 163, audit assurance. Got three, well, children living care and children with disability payment, got a limited code. I'm just wondering what the implications of that may be. Page 163.
I'm not hearing this terribly well, Gilbert, I'm afraid. If someone can answer, Gilbert.
Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Page 163, children leaving care and children disability payment.
Yeah.
He said, what is the implication of it being limited? What does limited mean? I think that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, no, fair question. Understood.
Question.
Yeah. Michael, do you want to just make clear that on 163, there are 5 references to limited, including children leaving care, which Gilbert was concerned about.
Certainly. So the scoring on the audit reports is it comes out of the number of recommendations that are made and the rating of those recommendations. So they're rated as high, medium or low. And if there's more than one high recommendation, a report will be rated as low assurance. If there are multiple medium recommendations, then it can also lead to that same scoring. I'm just looking in the report because there should be a page where it sets out the scoring criteria. I'm afraid I don't have a numbered copy of the report, but if you come a few pages further into the report beyond where it talks about individual cases, there's a page titled Definitions of Assurance Levels, and it gives you that detail as to what the levels actually mean. So the actual recommendations themselves could be anything, but it's to do with the numbers of recommendations and the seriousness of the recommendations that gives the overall report rating.
Excellent. No other questions? If we can then move on, and I think, Michael, you're going to do this as well, which is training availability for audit members. I have written out to members about the opportunities, and I would just add my encouragement, and it is part of our terms of reference, that we ensure that members of the Audit Committee are properly informed and fully informed about both their responsibilities and the framework within which they're operating. And I think, Michael, you're going to just talk about the couple of opportunities that I'd certainly like members to take up.
Certainly. So there's 2 training opportunities that are currently available. The first one is an offer from SIPFA, which is an online webinar over 2 days, 2 mornings. It's a good introduction to the actual role of the Audit Committee, what new members in particular need to be aware of. I think that the particular emphasis is on assurance, which we've just talked about in relation to the audit work. It's about risk, which you've heard a lot about tonight, and it's also about current issues that audit committees should be aware of. The content is going to be similar to what seasoned members of the committee will have experienced before. We've had a SIPFA trainer that has come to Hackney on 2 occasions in recent years and delivered training, so this will be similar to that, and I would recommend it particularly to anybody that's new to the committee as a good way of getting up to speed. And those courses are being run on the mornings of the 22nd and the 23rd of June, and then the same course repeated on the 8th and the 9th of September. So either set of dates would be fine. I know, Chair, that you invited people to contact with me. I have had 1 or 2 responses, and we'll make sure that they get booked on. If there's anybody else that would like to take advantage of that, please come back to me sooner rather than later before it gets booked up, particularly those June dates, and we'll make sure that we reserve those slots. The other training activity that was also circulated as part of the chair's message was an Lga Finance Workbook, which I'd flag as potentially useful to anybody who maybe hasn't got the in-depth finance background prior to taking up a position on the Audit Committee. I remember 10 years ago when I first started coming to these meetings, and some of the acronyms were confusing to me too. So rather than sit in the room and not be sure, it's something that can be done at one's own convenience. It's not a massively long exercise, I don't think. It's something that could be dipped in and out of as suits, and I would recommend it as an introduction if some of this is new to you. So, okay, I'll pause there.
Just with regard to the webinars, are there online libraries where they're stored so that if you can't make that morning, you can watch it later on at your own convenience?
Yeah, good question. Don't know the answer to it. Michael, do you know if they're available as a recorded webinar?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. I'll certainly check with SIPFA, but I believe it's an event that's run there and then. It's not something I've seen before, but I'll definitely let you know if it's otherwise.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, I think it would be very good feedback to SIPFA that they need to post-pandemic recovery numerous work. That might be an option they should look at. And certainly difficult for me as well to take additional time of work.
Yes. Yeah.
Alternatively, could you do a webinar, Nick? You know, an online kind of video with Ian, just to.
Yeah, Ian and I could do a double act.
Serious. I just wonder. I wasn't joking.
I mean, it's a nice idea, actually. I mean, of a resource, and I do think the issue Margaret's making about the wider.
I think that's for all of members, because we've just all got to get our head around what's coming over the hill, essentially. So I think that's incredibly important. I think for all members to have something around what it all means.
Yes. Yeah.
I think, do you not agree, guys? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
I think so.
Well, can we take all these? I mean, I think it's a really positive suggestion.
Well, me and your chair, David, we can sort this out, can't we?
Yeah, we can.
We can.
Which we go. We'll take aboard. I think excellent ideas, because I do think we all need better background training on. As I say, going back to my original thing, we're about to face a real storm, I think, over the next couple of years in terms of budgets, and it's not a specialist area. This is where politics and finance really mix, and we have to understand the language of both, actually.
No money, no activities.
Yeah, good point. Great. Okay, thanks for that, Michael. And yeah, encourage you. We'll come back positively with that. But meanwhile, I do hope that people will take up the opportunities on the table. We're into the final stretch. Audit Committee work programme, I think, is our usual thing. The only addition I'd like to make, I mean, given that this is the first meeting of the new council year, I do think that there is an area that is ripe for development in terms of our thinking, and that's how we judge value for money in the organisation. This is a big issue in which the government is increasingly asking external auditors to have, rather than the sort of rather tick box attitude to value for money, they're increasingly asking, rightly in my view, about whether the councils are in a position to manage their expectations in the medium term. And I do think we need to pick this challenge up and make sure audit isn't just about looking at the past, about the past accounts. It's actually about, is this organisation in good shape to cope with the future? And that's the debate going on nationally at the moment about how we can ask external auditors to look more closely at that issue. And I just think it's something that we might pick up going forward over the next year, but how, as Hackney, we are now not just looking at the immediate budget stuff, vital though that is. We're actually looking at how is the council cope with the really big challenges coming down the track. So I just wanted to launch that as a thought to you, and possibly come back in October with some ideas about how we might put that together. Meanwhile, the next meeting we had down in the plan, because we always have the 26th of July as the time when we have the annual accounts reported to us, in happier times when people haven't undermined the whole system. So we've kept that in the diary, and I propose to do it. I'm hoping that we can get some decent management accounts out, that we can report what we think is the position of the council. If that is purely informational, we might use that date for one of the deep dive sessions instead. So if you can keep it in your diary, and it might either be a substantive meeting or a meeting of the Audit Committee in its deep dive form, but we'll let you know depending on how the audit process unwinds.
Chair, when would be the August deep dive then?
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. When I saw Jackie suggesting August, I could already hear people saying, wait a minute, that's our month off time. I think we'd have to find a time when it's either maybe later in the month when people are all back, would be my thought. It's more likely to get people there. Yeah.
Go anywhere.
Okay. Anyway, we will explore. We will explore options. Gilbert, you wanted to come in. Yeah.
And our sustainable procurement strategy. And one of the guiding principles of that is primary focus for aim and guiding principles of the strategy to be deliver the various priorities and strategic objectives of best value through a straightforward professional procurement. I feel that might be an important aspect to look at in terms of the complication of best value to keep the sustainable procurement strategy in mind when you're looking at that.
No, I think it's a good example of what I'm trying to say. Here's a big commitment that we made. Are we in shape to actually fulfill those commitments? And that's the job of the Audit Committee, not to question the policies. Those have been put down. It's whether we are, as an organisation, fit for that purpose. And I think that's exactly where we should ask in 4 areas. We were talking earlier about climate being another one, and this is another one. So I think applying these sort of big issues about the best value, because that is not, because in one sense the scrutiny commissions are there to examine it in particular areas, but I think there are some overall issues about the management strength, financial resources available to the council to match those ambitions against what we have actually got. And so that's exactly what I mean about having a look at best value, and again, it'd be useful to think through the areas that we might address on that. Great. Well, I'm very conscious, and thank you so much for being so patient for over 2 hours in this very difficult environment. But I think we've covered some excellent ground, and we're really delighted with the contributions people have made. And thank everyone for coming, and look forward to our next meeting. Yeah. Yeah, great.